tulema sinu juurest ju.
Jah. Pidi esimene oleks see
ei olnud ju. Esimene on tasemes. See ongi see, miks me teeme koos. Ootame Mihkli ära, sest et muidu on see, me räägime ühe korra veel.
tere õhtust, good evening, tere tulemast järjekordsele residentuuri sarja üritusele EMA juures. EMA siin siis tähenduses Eesti Elektroonilise Muusika Seltsi ansambel. So welcome to another residency, open residency, public residency, together with ensemble from Estonian Electronic Music Society. Ja täna õhtul on meil teemaks siis ruumiheli. Ruumiheli muidugi on temaatika, millest võib rääkida vägagi pikalt ja vägagi põhjalikult. Loomulikult selle lühikese aja jooksul, mis meil täna õhtul kasutada on, ei saa me seda katta, seda teemat ammendavalt, aga me tahaksime just rääkida seda või avada seda teemat seoses siis konkreetselt meie ansambli võimalustega ja mõningate uute rakendustega, mida siis Teet ja Tarmo on ansambli jaoks valmistanud. So today's subject will be, and the lecture will be in English, no worries. Subject will be about sound in space, and it is indeed a very large subject, so we cannot it is a subject we could talk about for a long time and much more in detail than today we'll be doing. But we would like to address this subject today from the perspective of our own group. The group of 6 players and 6 speakers. And so we would like to demonstrate our possibilities and a new app that Tarmo and Ted programmed for us, which would allow new possibilities for the group also, and hopefully it would inspire the composers to think about it also when writing us new pieces. Meil on siis väike loengu osa ja samuti siis me mängime teile ka muusikat, so we have a small theoretical part and also we'll play some music for you. Ja olete rohkem kui teretulnud esitama küsimusi, lihtsalt andke käega märku, segage meile vahele, küsige, see on vägagi teretulnud. Ja loomulikult need, kes vaatavad meid YouTube'is, olge hea, kirjutage oma küsimused sinna kommentitesse ja me katsume neile siis vastata. So you are more than welcome to ask any questions or post any comments if you like about the subject, and to do so, if you are online, then write in YouTube stream comments these questions, or if you want to say something about the subject or argue, if you will. But without further ado, I would give a microphone to Ted Theodor Pake, who would give us a bit sort of an insight about the theory of sound in space in very brief.
Thank you. So yes, as Tavi said, as I already mentioned, to try to cover this topic in even one lecture is would be a bit absurd. As even the idea of spatialization in room sound is not exactly the same topic even. But they do share some things, and some of the theory that you learn in one subject can actually be translated over to the other subject. So in that essence, we try to give at least somewhat of an overview of at least some components that might be interesting for a composer to think about. So next slide, please. So the easiest way, I think, to kind of break down this idea, and it's also the way it's done in any sort of natural science sense, is to think about 3 kind of components. One is the component of how I listen in my head. What's actually going on with my eardrum, what's actually going on in my brain. We have a whole system here, and it works a certain way. The second component is to actually think about the sound as it is in the space, without thinking about what we hear, but actually what is the behavior of sound as it moves inside of a space. And then the third component, which would traditionally be called instrument acoustics. In our case, our sounds all come from speakers. So the instrument acoustic is actually the speaker itself. And for today, the biggest concern is to think about what the speaker setup is and what can be done with that speaker setup inside of a space. Now, one additional kind of thing for us to think about, I believe, is if you take your kind of common listener, I mean, not a trained musician, not a trained conductor, the idea that the space and the sound are different things is actually not true. If you hear a sound, you also hear a space. And if you hear a space, you also hear a sound. This all arrives at the same time. Now, if you're a very trained musician, you can somehow kind of reverse engineer how you experience things to start to separate the idea of a sound and the idea of a space, and that maybe you can hear a difference in this. For your common listener, this is not really something that exists. So it should be something to think about when preparing music for an audience that makes use of spatialization or makes use of a room sound. Next slide, please, Doris. So the first thing I want to talk about is just some aspects that talk about our hearing. And I'm only going to talk about a couple of things. The two are distance and localization. So when we talk about localization, what we mean is how do I locate a sound inside of a space? If I have a cello on my right-hand side and it starts to play, how do I know that it's coming from the right-hand side? What is it that's going on in my head that allows me to hear that? Now, basically, it works essentially one way, is that there is a comparison between one ear and the other ear. So the cello sound coming from my right-hand side hits this ear, and then these two compare. Okay? Now, what exactly do they compare? Well, that's where things get a little bit more complicated. So, the first option is called interaural time difference. Now, what that means is that, if you think about an imaginary cello again, the sound reaches my right ear before it reaches my left ear. So there is a slight time difference between one ear and the other. And so my brain can calculate that difference enough to inform me that the sound is now on my right-hand side. This also works for level differences, or to more layman's terms, volumes differences. So if the sound of the cello reaches my right ear, it's going to be slightly louder than when it reaches my left ear. And my brain uses this information to compare between the two. Now, why the two differences? Well, it ends up being that for different frequencies we are better at some, and other frequencies we're better at other. So for level differences above 4,000 hertz, this is much more clear. And for below 1,000, we use the time difference. Now in between 1,000 and 4,000, we use both, basically. So nonetheless, this idea of localization still depends on this comparison of the ear. And if you're like me, the first question I ever asked when I learned this was, okay, can I deceive my ear? Can I convince myself that the sound is there when actually it's over there? And actually, yes, it is possible. We will talk about this in a bit of a second, actually, how this might be possible. The second thing that I also considered was, well, how many sound sources can I localize? Is it 3 or 4? Is it 60? If there's 60 sounds around me, can I tell where all of them are in the space? Well, this is not an easy answer. If you take someone who has nothing to do with music, doesn't really listen to music, doesn't really listen even. There are people who exist, probably. They cannot actually localize a ton of sound in a space. Maybe 3 or 4 they can tell, maybe 6. But if you take the conductor of an orchestra, someone who's actually trained themselves to do such a thing, they can localize several sound sources in front of them. So there is this curious feature about human listening, actually, that sure, we have some sort of biologically machine, you could say, but we are also somehow able to kind of train ourselves to go in strange places with it. So it is also something to consider when working on a composition. How many sound sources are you actually demanding of your listener to tell the difference between inside of a space. And how do you communicate that? Next slide, please. So, when I first mentioned this, I talked about it abstractly, but if we think about the sound in an actual space, like the space we're in now, it isn't just the sound of my voice reaching your eardrums, or for those of you at home hearing it through headphones. It's also the sound that's bouncing off of the wall that hits your eardrums. And this is confusing, because you think, okay, I hear the sound from his voice, but I also hear the sound bouncing off of the wall. How does the brain know which one is the real me and which one is the reflection of me, actually? And the current theory is, and it is just a theory actually, is that our brain takes the first one that it hears. So if you hear the sound of my voice first, the direct sound from my voice to your ear, and then you hear the reflection after, then the location information is my voice directly to you, not the reflection. This is where there's an opportunity to actually cause confusion for the brain. There are famous halls in Europe that actually the reflection gets to you first before the sound of the direct sound from my voice. And you are confused about where the sound is located in the space. So this is known as the precedence effect. The first sound wave that hits your ear will be the precedent sound wave. All reflections after that are used for communicating spatial information about the space that you're in. Okay, next sound, or next slide. So that deals with the idea of location. The kind of second idea that we can talk about in reference to spatialization is the kind of concept of distance, or how close something is to me or how far away something is from me. And I can say that actually a lot less is known about distance perception than is known about how we locate the sound. It's quite a bit more complicated. But there's at least 4 things you can kind of keep as a general rule if you want to work with kind of creating distance or depth perception inside of your composition. The first is the kind of ratio between the direct sound and the reflected sound. So if I have this imaginary cello player next to my head, and I move him very, very, very far away from me. I can't in this room, it's a small room, but let's just say I can do it, you know. Then he's so far away that this direct sound from the cello gets quieter the farther away he goes, and the reflections become stronger. So then I depend on the balance between that direct sound and the reflection. So if you're working with some sort of kind of reverb tool inside of a DAW, you can actually simulate distance by balancing between your dry signal and your reverberated signal. The second, which is pretty much obvious to anybody who thinks about it, is just the loudness. Things that are closer to us we generally think are louder. Things that are farther away we generally think are quieter. That's just you can test your own hearing for that. The third, and this is probably the easiest feature to simulate inside of a composition or inside of a speaker array, is that distant sounds tend to lose high frequencies. High frequencies don't have a lot of power, they can't travel very far, and so therefore the farther away the sound is, the less high frequency components will be in the sound. So filtering out high frequencies can also create a sense of distance in a sound. And the last, and this is also something you can test out on your own when you're walking home, is movement perception. Generally, if something's very close to us, we can hear it moving. If you tap your fingers next to your eardrum and move your arm around, you can hear quite well how it moves. But if you start to move it away, your ability to tell the motion gets worse. So generally, very, very, very far away sounds, we don't hear their movement. We just hear the general space that they're in. So we're not particularly good at perceiving motion for distant sounds. So these are kind of the 4 key things to keep in mind if you're trying to create a sense of distance amongst the speaker system. Next. So with that said, that was a bit about what we hear just inside of our own head. But then what about the kind of conditions of a room, and how does this actually affect the sound? And again, it's another very deep topic that we could spend hours on. But I just give a short overview of what the kind of variables ought to keep in mind. So, room acoustics, we're talking about the behavior of a sound in a room. And we kind of got three important concepts that we should kind of keep in mind. One is the direct sound, which I've already referenced. This is the sound as it travels from the sound source to your eardrum, without any reflections, without any influence from the room. The second are early reflections. These are referred to as the first reflections that occur in the space. Generally, they're thought of as existing anywhere from 5 milliseconds up to 80 milliseconds. This is a rough range. And then we have the reverberation field, which is when so many reflections occur that speaking about any particular individual one would be somewhat pointless. So I think it's good to have a kind of rough visual idea of what this actually looks like. And if we could have the next slide, please, Doris. Yeah. My favorite is the gun shooting the man demonstration. This is famous amongst acousticians. Everyone who works with acoustic has seen this. It's still quite funny to this day. But actually, originally, many years ago, a kind of gun was used for measuring reverberation time. Just gave a small pop, and you could measure how long the sound lasted in the space. So the reason for a gun is not because of some morbid thing about shooting people. So this shows us already that we have a bang. The direct sound travels from the gun, hits the person who's listening. Now, it's important to keep in mind still that the distance that person is away from the sound, the quieter the sound will be. Sound gets quieter as it travels between the source and the person listening. So then the next one, next slide, please. But the direct sound doesn't only travel to your ears, it also travels to the wall and the floor and the ceiling. And the sound meets at that surface, and two important things happen right then. The first thing is part of the sound actually gets absorbed into the material. So it depends on what type of material the wall surface is, how much of that sound gets absorbed. So that means that the reflection that comes out bouncing from the wall is actually going to be quieter because some of the sound energy has been absorbed. Secondly, what aspects of the sound get absorbed depends on the material as well. So you could think of materials absorbing sound almost kind of like a filter. Not all frequencies pass through, right? And this ends up giving a lot of impressions to the person who's listening. So for example, if a lot of high frequencies get absorbed by the surface, the first reflection, then it can give the perception to the listener that actually they're in a very kind of dark space. And the space is very kind of not very bright. And this can cause clarity issues. Speech would be a problem in that scenario, understanding what people say. So these early reflections actually determine a lot. If not very much of the sound gets absorbed, let's say just a small percentage of it, then the reflection actually will sound like an echo. So anyone's who ever been in a place where they've heard natural echo, something actually echoing back at you, that's an early reflection that doesn't get absorbed enough by the surface, and it just bounces back at you. That's what's happening there. Okay, and then the next slide. So as these early reflections continue to bounce all around the room, there's so many of them that we actually have the sensation of being inside of a sound. And this is what we call, acousticians call, a reverberation field. Okay? And so literally it looks something like we see in this photo, where there's just so many reflections going around the listener that any one reflection doesn't cause anything, but several give the impression that you're actually inside of a space. So the reverberation field, what it sounds like, again, has to do with the absorption that happens at the walls. So a very bright reverberation field would mean high frequencies are not getting absorbed at the walls. A very dark one would mean high frequencies are getting absorbed. Now, it is a strange concept to talk about what is a good reverberation sound, because every space is drastically different. In fact, they've attempted many times to recreate famous acoustic halls in Europe, and almost universally every time they fail, because there's just so many elements involved that it's very difficult to calculate. So this idea of a good sounding space or creating a good sounding space is somehow a strange idea. Maybe it would be more accurate to think what types of music suit certain types of places, more so than to think what is a good space or a bad space. So that deals with the idea of room acoustics. So what types of effects can cause in this field of room acoustics? So reverberation and early reflections can distort localization. They also can improve localization, actually. They can distort the perception of timbre. Sounds can sound darker, or sounds can sound brighter, or sounds can sound like they've been comb filtered due to the space. The three common terms that are used for in room acoustics by acousticians are clarity, warmth, and brightness. I won't bore you with the mathematics here. If you type in room acoustics clarity, it's going to show you exactly what the ratios are necessary to achieve that. And I will leave that to you. But these are the kind of general concepts that are used for determining what a space sounds like. So clarity means that the sound is very clear. The room helps the sound to be clear. I can hear details. Warmth makes the room sound warm, and brightness makes the room sound bright. So moving on to the next concept. So first was dealing with this psychoacoustics, or how we hear things in our head. Second was thinking about the sound inside of a space. And now we get a bit closer to what we're dealing with inside of our ensemble, which is different types of speaker setups, actually. So speaker arrangements. Now, as I said before, if you deal with a cello, you actually have to deal with the acoustics of a cello. But the acoustics of a speaker, luckily, are actually much simpler than that, and almost don't even warrant being talking about. But the types of speaker setups, this is where things get quite interesting. So mono is the most simplest. I suppose everybody knows what mono is. If I show up to a gig with one speaker and my synthesizer, I plug into the speaker and I play, and that is mono. I can't move the sound around unless I want to run around with the speaker. Then I could move it, but otherwise I can't move the sound. One sound, one speaker. And prior to the advancements we will show you a bit later, our ensemble actually operated as 6 mono players. So each speaker you could think of as one instrument. We couldn't move the sound around. We just had each player had their own speaker, 6 mono. Then after mono comes stereo, which is the kind of consumer technology. Most everybody probably has some version of stereo at home, I would think. And with stereo, we got the opportunity to start panning things. And it's worth kind of thinking about, could I get the next slide, please? It's worth kind of thinking about why this stereo was even invented. You know, why have 2 speakers that I can pan or move a sound in between and have different placements in it? Well, actually, the reason this stereo was created was actually to create the same image that you would see on a stage if you went to see a concert. So if you go to see a concert in 1964, 65, before big PA systems existed, you would have the guitar on the left side, the drums in the middle, the vocalists kind of somewhere in the middle, maybe a keyboard off to the right, and bass player somewhere in the middle to the right, you know. But as we needed bigger systems to play in bigger stadiums, we needed a PA. And so stereo was kind of chosen to be the universal system because it allows me to move the sound between the 2 speakers. So if I want the sound right in front of me, then the gain or the volume of the sound equally comes from both speakers. If I want the sound to be a little bit to the left of me, okay, 75% of the volume of that sound goes to left speaker, 25% to the right. So this placement of the sound allowed us to create the kind of stage image that we would see in front of us in a normal concert. The other possibility this opened up was the idea of moving the sound in real time between two speakers, which is kind of a really exciting possibility. And once we extend the amount of speakers, we actually get even more opportunities for that. Next slide, please. So after stereo became the kind of commercial important system to use, electronic music actually got more interested in what became quadraphonic, or now we have the idea of surround sound. So quadraphonic is the first version of a kind of surround sound system. And the way it works is the listening position is in the middle, and you can just think of there being overlapping stereos going all around you. So from the left speaker to the right speaker to behind me, etc., etc. And that has become one of the most standard operations, maybe up until 15 years ago. Most electronic music was performed quadraphonically. Now, it does bring a kind of strange point up, because the standard for all newer types of diffusion systems or large speaker setups is that the listener is in the middle, surrounded by a lot of speakers, whether it's a circle or a dome, or probably maybe you've seen something like that in your lifetime. And this is a bit weird if you think that, well, what's the most important sound to me? And usually the answer is the sound that's in front of me. It's quite obvious. My ears face that way, my eyes face that way, the sound arrives at my face. If I want to hear the sound behind me, typically I would just turn around. So this brings up an important point if you're working with sound that surrounds your listener, and you're creating very, very complicated localization in front of them. You're moving the sound all over the place in front of them. Okay, they can probably perceive that. But if you do it now behind them, they probably can't perceive that so well. So we have this strange thing where many of the systems that are being developed are kind of saying that it's equal. The sound behind me is just as important as the sound in front of me. But it's actually not true based on how we're designed. So it's something to consider actually when thinking about speaker setups. The last thing that I will mention about this actually before we give a small demonstration, I guess, would be that there are lots of possibilities for speaker arrangements. You can set up speakers in a line, you can set up speakers in an L, you can hang speakers from the ceiling if you are safe about it. There's a lot of possibilities that you could easily experiment even with 6 mono speakers. So I think it's important to kind of keep in mind that the opportunities available with even a 4-speaker type system. So, do we have any questions? Yeah, maybe in the hall. Okay. If not, then we will demonstrate playing a piece by Kosemets. One small fragment of a much larger piece called Loon Harmonic, which actually deals with how sine waves move and the differences between sine waves, and actually this will cause a kind of spatial sensation even without kind of moving the sound around. So,
and tere õhtust. Thanks for coming and thanks for watching. Who is following us on YouTube, then you probably wonder where are we, which are these medieval walls, and we are in the Estonian Museum of Theatre and Music, and it's a really good place where a big concentration and thinking about things has been practiced in hundreds of years. And the museum also is great, so we're all welcome to visit it in another day too. Udo Kasemets, he is a really interesting Estonian-Canadian composer, rather experimental one, and this particular piece for 6 oscillators, it takes its inspiration from Chinese lunar calendars, and following their systems, these 6 oscillators change their pitches. So between harmonics, lun harmonics, luna and harmonics, move from one frequency to another one. And so there's 6 oscillators, 5 of them are stable during some certain time duration, and 1 is moving. So you start to hear all kind of different beatings and different tones and so on. And in the score, there are some a little bit cryptical numbers that Kasemets wrote that you can actually decide how you use them and on which kind of parameters you apply them. But if you have a sine tone, then there's not so much what you can do. What are the parameters of the sine tone? Because the loudness is given, the frequencies are given, and now we wanted to try if we move the sine waves in a space. So in the second part of the playing, we did it a little bit. I don't know how much you could hear, but anyway, we found a possibility here. Also, today it's the very first time to try out and also present our brand new system to deal with specialization in our ensemble. Because usually what we do, it is that we use 6 mono signals to 6 speakers. So every player has its own speaker. We don't deal with stereo files or moving the sound around. It's like in a string sextets that every instrumental is in its own place. And we are in the space anyway, so that it creates some interesting effects anyway if different people play. Also, in that way, this 6 times mono, you can localize who is doing what much better. And also for us, we can hear much better what we do. But still, it's fun and then sometimes very also necessary to move the sound around. And there were some pieces, some composers who actually wanted it, and it was about half a year ago we started to think that maybe we can do something, and we developed a system together with Ste, then was standby, and now in the recent days we work it. I tried to explain shortly how it works, so it might help if you think about writing a piece, just to know what is possible. In the first case, our sound cards, or the sound interfaces, are connected directly to the speaker. There's only one cable, only one channel is going to the speaker in the normal case. But now every player sends its signals to a central sound interface. It's this black box here in between. And there is a computer program that takes these 6 inputs, and the program is able to pan actually these signals. And we prepared 2 versions for the panning. One is actually stereo panning within these 6, so the players or the speakers, you can move sound between 1 and 6, 2 and 5, 3 and 4. So in a bigger space it could be possible to have also kind of depth, so you have pairs of sound that move around. we are very curious if it actually works to try it out in some bigger space. And another way that we can do every single player is to position or pan the signal between the 6. So we can move around the signal through all the speakers. Or we can route the signal to any specific speaker. So, yeah, in a moment. So that we can, if I want to send my sound to there, it's possible. And how we do it, now the user interface is now here on the screen. And the software that is in between, it's called Open Stage Control. It's an open source, quite flexible software where you can build simple interfaces that send out OSC messages. OSC stands for Open Sound Control. And basically what you do, you send a quite simple message with a name and then some data to some program that can do something with it. And here you can see on this interface, first we can choose which player we want to control. It's usually it's myself in my case, but also today we need sometimes that somebody is very busy and someone else can move your sound if you are, if it's needed. And then we can choose between the stereo panning, between the pairs, and the 6-channel panning, so it's between the 6. And there is one slider, so we can move it left, right, or in the semicircle. And then we can route the signal to any given speaker. And then also there are small experimental features. We can make auto pan so that their signal moves automatically between the speakers, or random panning so that it jumps to different positions randomly up in a given frequency. And yesterday when we tried it out here in this space, and actually it was, wow, nice. And somehow it gives actually some depth. So it's a little bit different perception than playing 6 times mono. Yeah, so was it a little bit followable, or can I explain something better? Yeah, and the first piece actually that required some kind of specialization, and it was in the time when we started to develop it, but didn't finish by the premiere, was by my wife, Tatiana Kozlova-Johannes, and the piece we have played also in this series, it's called Aria. And there is written in that some background sounds need to move. Let me try. So that if there's some kind of wind sound, it's written in the score, the panning, that in some kind of gesture it needs to move to left and right. And then so together with a volume and between different players, it creates some kind of living background, and then there are the solo voices in between. Please. Okay, yeah. The question was why not to use 6 times stereo mixer? One very simple reason is that then we need a sound interface with at least 12 inputs, and we don't. And also it gets a little bit too messy. So if we have 6 times stereo, then we should decide which are the stereo output channels. But now we are much more flexible doing other things.
Also, we need someone to control that mixer, and there's only 6 of us. So that would mean that every time someone wrote a piece, one person would have to be in charge of diffusion. But in this case, each one of us can be in charge of their own movement of the sound.
There was actually one piece by Lithuanian composer Vykintas Jurgutis that had stereo files, and then we had to control them a little bit. And then our solution was that we sent out stereo to the main mixer because it went for a web concert in Estonian Music Days, so the listeners were online mostly anyway. But on spot we still played the sum of the two channels in our local speaker. But yeah, in that case, to have 6 times of stereo, that everyone would have 2 speakers, and if it would make sense and work out, so it probably would get already a bit messy. Yes.
Question for the piece, were you using some custom notation by the composer, or is it some kind of standard notation?
In that case, it's a nice mixture between standard notation and graphical and text explanations. So there is, for the panning, there's just one line that going from left to right and back. And this piece was also introduced in our first lecture dealing notation, so you will can see more examples there, or ask us. So we're happy to share the scores. But then, just as a very short example, we tried to move this, the wind. Me and Doris as 2 of the background players. So just a very short demo. In the audience, could you hear any moving at all? Yeah. Okay. That was the idea by the composer. So, a question?
Continuation to the same question is that what about automation?
The question was, what about automation? It's not there more yet. So there is this autopan that we as players we can choose which is the frequency. Then the sound starts to move back and forth. So this is one very small similar automation, and the other one is the random pannings. And again, we can choose the frequency, how fast the random positions will happen. And that's what we have now. But as it is OSC, so everything is open and it's possible to develop in different ways. And also it could be part of the composer's material to actually prepare these automated OSC signals.
Because it could be related to the our weekly process.
And what Tavi said, that it could be also related to our V-click, our visual click track system, that it is theoretically possible to also send some kind of signals according to a very certain moment. Do you have any more questions, or we continue with a small impro just to play around with the space? What did you hear? It's moving a lot, absolutely. Yeah, this is the thing that, of course, everybody who has got some kind of knob of socialization and his first thing is... yeah.
Yeah, one thing I would recommend against for composers writing for us, although, yeah, you do what you want, but very commonly when having a student who works with spatialization the first time is they want to spin the sound around the listener as fast as possible. And that is a quick way to make people throw up, you know. So there is some things to consider about this, actually. What you might think works in the abstract and what really works in terms of perceiving it is not the same thing necessarily.
Yeah, a question? The question was, is it possible to encode into stereo? Yes, one way could be that we would send our signals all to the two outer speakers, so that we have the 1 and 6, and then we pan between these. Yes, yeah. Yeah, in some conditions. It would need a bit more work. And what we do actually now for the YouTube, that we have actually a stereo mix of what is happening here that is sent to YouTube and mix, so that this one kind of stereo mix is happening anyway. Yes, one question?
All right. So with the complex spatial sound systems, the position of the listener usually becomes very important, and this creates a lot of problems. One, the live players cannot properly monitor what the listeners hear. Two, parts of the audience may not hear the effects as intended. And three, and so it also becomes less of a shared listening experience for the audience and more an individual experience for each listener. How do you deal with these problems in live performance?
If I may comment for a minute, we just talked about it in the rehearsal, basically, because discovering this new system of specialization, we of course immediately realized these are exactly the first problems. You know, first of all, like Ted already pointed out, if we talk about already a quadraphonics, you know, it's very difficult to achieve the proper quadraphonic equal quadraphonic situation, right? Or we have to measure it very carefully just to try to equalize what is going in the back and what is happening in the back and so on. All that said is that we could imagine about some kind of ideal position in the audience, but I think that most of the cases it doesn't exist really. If we have more audience than, let's say, 5 or 10 people, right? But this wouldn't mean that we shouldn't use it. I think that it depends how crazy we get about the purity of this idea, maybe, and more about the concept of how we're using the material. And the one issue what we immediately realized when playing was obviously that it's much more difficult to control your own volume if you are moving around and to the speaker, which is, let's say, 10 meters from you. So we already thought about possibility of performing or at least trying to play once from the position of the audience, so that we could all hear the similar result or more similar result. Because already acoustically here we are in a situation where the speaker is either on the side or on the back, you know, and by the experience we can imagine the levels, you know, and what we have rehearsed, and sometimes we rehearse it so that we go to the hall and we listen and we go back and so on, right? But it's never ideal. So it is, anyways, I think everybody's own experience. There is no hope that anybody would hear it in the same way, even if we would use headphones, because already we are built differently. But I think if one would want more similar result acoustically, then it's headphones is the way to go. The same types of headphones for everybody from the same age group, I would say, or something. Right? But Ted knows much more about it.
You? No. Yeah. Yeah, adding more monitors to the situation, I think. Maybe you've noticed a lot of cables on the ground already. We have discussed one possible solution is that we each have our own in-ear mixers, but this solves the problem for us, but it doesn't solve the problem for the audience. Although, I mean, back to this question that not everybody gets to experience the same thing in the spatialization. Well, that's true for any concert hall, isn't it? I mean, if you sit in the back of a concert hall, you're not hearing the exact same sound that someone who's sitting in the front of the concert hall is. So this has never been egalitarian situation, the concert hall. That is kind of a myth. It's never really existed in the first place. So, of course, ideally, you want to create spatialization so that somebody hears it. And I can tell you right now from my years of working with many different types of diffusion systems that this is the question that everybody's asking, is how do we get the center to be bigger? How do we get more people in the middle? And actually there's technological limitations to this, and there's also huge financial limitations to this. So the ideal is really not on the table, not only for us, but it's not on the table for major universities even. So we have to deal with the technology as it grows and hope that in so many years we can better suit this type of problem in the future. For me, it's not so tragic. Well, in the concept of a great listening environment is not really... nobody knows what that really means, actually. It's not clear what that means.
But why not to use some food or other controllers for spatialization? What about spatial or stereo effects?
So the question was, why not to use foot controllers if the other limbs are taken? Sure. Yeah. If we would be able to control it, yeah. But yeah, I mean, theoretically, of course, it is possible. Then we just need to practice it, and it's definitely possible. But then just brainstorming about it, because I'm a bit of a fan of the controllers. So most of the most common foot controller would be this kind of expression pedal, right? And so if you put the expression pedal, and then you would think that, okay, the upper position would be left and the down position would be right, or something like that, and then you would want to put it into a third or the fourth speaker suddenly, it would be quite difficult to control. Of course, you could then think of some discrete controller, meaning that it's a switch on-off kind of switch, and then you could program it to go to this or that speaker. This, I think, could be doable. Or you could also program, probably, I'm just brainstorming, thinking loud, that you could, let's say if I switch number 3, then it goes with a certain time, goes to the number the speaker number 3. I think it's doable, but at the end, I think it all comes down to the idea what the composer wants, and whether it should, how precise it should be also. And is it more like an improvised situation, or is it more like very precisely programmed? And if this is the latter one, I would go for automated situation. If the timeline is fixed, then probably it could be programmed that the sound is moving with a fixed timeline and our click system to a certain speaker if it matters a lot to the composer, I think. This would be a most practical situation. If it's more improvised or choice of the performer, why not to use a foot controller indeed?
So, hello, I'm Doris. If anyone asks why the microphone was given to me, then the next thing we're gonna show is last thing that we're gonna show is one of the pieces I wrote to the ensemble, and it's maybe worth showing because when I wrote it, then we didn't have this fancy systems of using mobiles and panning ourselves, and when I wrote the piece, the first thing that came to my mind was that I want to play with spatialization and panning. And so the piece is called Majakas, which is lighthouse in English. And what I wanted to do was this effect of almost like standing in the sea and the waves coming through you, like as a listener who sits in the center. So if you're sitting on one of the sides, then it's just passing you by. So on the notation, you can also see that it is kind of written in a way that you see that if you're in the middle of the lines, then it's like the sound is passing through you, taking into account the effects that Ted talked about, that how the frequency and how the loudness should be written in this case. Well, I didn't add any filters or anything, but yeah, I used simpler media. And so this is one way you can write a piece with spatialization, writing it into a note. But then there was a problem that people were getting arguments and they didn't want to sit next to each other anymore. So Davi decided to sit on the other side of the room. I decided to sit to my best friend Tarmo, and then we had this situation that everybody was sitting in a wrong place, not according to this note, and we did this thing that we routed the speakers, that we didn't listen to ourselves to the speaker that was behind us, but we were routing it with the cables. So you might understand it took like 20 minutes to get the sound into the correct speaker, and it was a problem. So now we have this fancy system that you don't have to route them physically, but you can actually take the Tarmo's app, and I'm in the app I'm choosing that I am Doris, because I am, and then I'm choosing which kind of the speaker I want to be. In my case, I'm actually the speaker that's behind me, so it's the easiest for me to play. But for example, for Tarmo, he's sitting in place 3, player 3, but he's actually 6. So he's actually listening to himself there. And it actually causes a problem that we do not listen to ourselves, the problem that was actually asked, that we do not hear ourselves. So very often what might happen is that you are playing the sound, you do not know how loud it is, so you're just physically, like you know that your volume button, when you put it to the maximum, then it's like maximum sound, and you see you have to play a piano, then you like put it 1/4 placement, and but it usually, it's not the best way to, it fails, yeah. It's like the first time when we did the physical routing, then it happened that everyone was like quiet and there was like this loud sound coming, and I'm like, who is doing it? And then you realize it's yourself, and it's like, okay, sorry. So this is very interesting try now. We tried it once, it was a bit of a failure, but let's try it again in a way that we are not sitting according to the players that when I wrote it and when we first played it, then we were sitting in right places and it was easy. Yeah, today we're sitting in a wrong placement, but the sound comes from the right speakers in a weird dynamics. And I'm also trying to play around. So first, when we did it, we only had this sound coming from your speaker, yeah, everything. But there is one place in this piece that maybe needs some movement. So we're gonna try this out. Also, the guys who are busy playing are playing, and the other players are routing them. So let's see how it's gonna end up. Nice hope, yeah.
Thank you. Do you have any questions in this moment? What is?
Thank you, first of all, for this inspiring evening. I have one question regarding how. First of all, thank you for this inspiring evening. I was just wondering how or based on what criteria do you divide the parts of the piece, or how do you choose which player will take what part in these compositions?
Well, I think it's rather a question to the composers. Because some composers already know our strengths and weaknesses, and then they write some passages playable to some to some people, and the others are good at some other techniques, and so they think of them. But this piece, I think Doris can comment it better, but I think all the parts were equal here. And so the sounds which we used were basically from the same root to everybody. So there was not so that the one part would have been more complicated than the other one. At least in this case. I don't, So you mean if there is a composition which was not composed for us, so how do we share? I think it's a very simple calculation. If somebody is good at very virtuosic slider movements, then we assign it to this guy, and or dancing on the foot controllers that I don't know Doris might be very good at, then it's her part. And you know, so this is I think we just calculate our strengths and weaknesses, and this is how it goes. But sometimes, for example, when we played this Grünberg program, Sven Grünberg music, I think it was interesting for us also to challenge ourselves to do things that we were not used to do sometimes. Like I remember Eke showing up to the rehearsing space with a very worried look hours before practicing some parts from Naxitralli animation movies, you know. And I think this, I'm sure he discovered a lot doing it.
Here's another YouTube question. Aren't the compositions dependent of an instrument you play, or the compositions, are they composed specially to you?
There are both possibilities are there. We have like this Kasemet's composition. I wish it was composed for us. This the first one we played, but so we tried to pick up pieces which are not written for us particularly, which we could do with our instrumentation. But we are absolutely very curious and excited about the idea of working with the composers and together in the collaboration with the composer. So because then I think if the piece is tailor suited to us, then the results might be even more exciting, because then we could also propose ideas to the composer with the means what we have, and as we are all a bit of gear addicts, you know, there are many things we could propose to the composer as far as possibilities go. But if there are no more questions, then we would finish here our meeting. Aitäh kõigile. Thank you everybody for attending here. It was pretty crowded in this medieval tower. And I hope there were people also online. And you're very much welcome to visit our next meetings. The series is also designed with our friends from Latvia and Lithuania in mind. So when it gets warmer, we will be also heading to Latvia and Lithuania, and we will do our residencies from there, but the online events remain, hopefully, and so you can be part of it, hopefully, too. If there are any questions or comments what you think of later on, you're most welcome to send them to our Facebook page, this Estonian Electronic Music Society's page. And once again, thank you very much, Eesti Teatri- ja Muusikamuuseum, the museum, Estonian Museum of Theatre and Music, and join us next time. Thank you. Aitäh!